There's a moment, and every instructor who's ever run a live fire range will tell you about it if you ask them at the right hour, after the recruits have gone home and the scoring tablets are face down on the table. There's a moment when you realize you don't actually know what you're looking at. You think you do. You've been doing this for years, decades even. You've seen 10,000 soldiers grip 10,000 weapons, and you know, the way your grandmother knows rain coming by the color of the sky, exactly what that grip is going to produce downrange. You can predict it. You can grade it before the trigger ever gets pulled. And then someone like Mara Voss walks into your range, and everything you thought you knew just tilts. I'm going to tell you what happened at Vereth 9 training station exactly the way I remember it. I was there. I was standing about 8 feet from the firing line when it started, and I was close enough to hear the instructor's voice crack, just a little, just for a second, when he said those words. I'll get to the words. First, you need to understand the place. Part 1, the station. Vereth 9 isn't pretty. Nobody's going to put Vereth 9 on a recruitment poster. That's for certain. It sits at the edge of the Tharsis cluster, which sounds glamorous if you've never been. But the reality is about 32 corrugated metal corridor sections bolted together into something that vaguely resembles a military facility if you squint and tilt your head. The artificial gravity runs about 6% under standard, which means you walk with this subtle bobbing quality that visitors usually don't notice until hour 2, when their calves start to burn and they can't figure out why. The air recyclers work, but they don't work well. There's a smell to the place, not unpleasant exactly, just this metallic undertone like the inside of an old coin mixed with something faintly ozone-sharp from the weapons charging stations. Recruits who have been there a few weeks stop noticing it. Visitors never stop noticing it. The firing range, Range 7, specifically, which is where this happened, is a long rectangular space carved into the far end of the station's rear module. The walls are this kind of composite material, matte black, designed to absorb energy discharge. The ceiling has overhead lighting, but it's spaced wide enough that there are genuine pockets of shadow between fixtures. So the range always has this slightly underlit, slightly dramatic quality that feels unintentional but somehow appropriate. Like the building knows what happens in here. There are 20 firing positions, standard configuration. Each one is a reinforced platform about a meter wide with a chest-high barrier in front, and the targets begin at 15 meters and extend all the way out to 400, which is ambitious for an interior range and possible only because the deep end of Range 7 extends into a secondary hull extension that juts out from the main station body like an architectural afterthought. The Galactic Defense Academy has been using Vereth 9 for 30 years. It's their Outer Rim training hub for the Joint Integration Program, which is the diplomatic name for the project where they put recruits from 16 different registered species together and attempt to produce something resembling a unified fighting force. It's a noble idea. The execution is, as you might expect, complicated. Because here's the thing about 16 different species trying to do the same task. They're not actually doing the same task. The Vane, for example, tall, bioluminescent, triple-jointed fingers, have a relationship with handheld weapons that's completely different from, say, a Drakari, who have essentially 2 thick fingers and a thumb that's more of a secondary palm than an actual opposable digit. Every species grips differently. Every species breathes differently. Every species has a different inner ear, a different center of gravity, a different relationship to the concept of aim. The GDA spent 40 years developing what they call the Unified Marksmanship Protocol, the UMP. It's a set of principles flexible enough that any registered species can technically comply with it while still using their body the way their body actually works. It's a genuine achievement, honestly. I don't want to diminish it. A lot of very smart people worked very hard on it. The problem, and this became very apparent at Vereth 9, is that humans don't actually fit the UMP. Not because humans are worse than the protocol. Because humans, in the specific area of handheld weapons, are bizarre in ways the protocol never anticipated. I'll explain that later. For now, the morning this all happened. Part 2, the morning. The integration cohort for that cycle was 47 recruits. Of those, 6 were human. The humans had arrived in the previous intake batch, 3 weeks before, after the GDA's Earth Liaison Office processed their applications. Standard stuff. The program had been integrating human recruits for about 11 years by then, long enough that it wasn't a novelty anymore, but not quite long enough that anyone had stopped making small adjustments for them. Mara Voss had been at Vareth 9 for those 3 weeks, and she had, in that time, established a reputation. Not a bad reputation exactly, more of a complicated one. She was 23 years old, 5'7" in Earth units, which translated to just barely average height in the cohort. Brown hair that she kept in a braid that she'd tuck up under her helmet during exercises. Brown eyes. Nothing remarkable to look at, which I mention because first impressions matter in this story, and none of the first impressions people had of Mara Voss were particularly dramatic. What was dramatic was how she moved. The other recruits, Vane, Drakari, a pair of Sulcan who were inseparable, 3 Horath, various others, they all moved with the particular quality of their species, which is to say they moved correctly for their biology. The Vane were precise and slightly slow, deliberate. The Drakari had that rolling, slightly side-to-side gait from their wide hips. The Horath, who were the largest, moved with a kind of ponderous confidence. Mara moved like something was always about to happen. It's hard to describe better than that. There was a readiness to her that wasn't tense. She wasn't a nervous person, not at all, but it was like she was always available to respond. Not waiting, just present. In the moment in a way that most beings aren't unless they're consciously trying to be. The other recruits had noticed it. Most of them found it slightly unsettling. The Sulcan pair, Rek and Adara, had started calling her something in their own language that roughly translated to the twitchy one, which wasn't quite accurate but came from the right place. The Vane, Sarathi, senior recruit, top of the cohort academically, precisely 12 years older than anyone else in the program and very aware of it, had a different assessment. She'd pulled me aside on week 2 and said, very quietly, "The human moves like prey that has learned to think like a predator." She said it the way you'd report a geological survey finding. Matter of fact. Not a compliment, not an insult, just an observation. I thought about that a lot, I still do. The morning of the range exercise was cold by Vareth 9 standards, which means the ambient temperature in the module corridors was about 16 degrees standard, and nobody had told the environmental systems to compensate. The recruits came in from morning formation in their training blacks. The uniform is designed to fit all standard body types in the integration program, which means it fits no one particularly well. And they were tired in the specific way of people who have been doing early morning physical training and would really like breakfast. Instructor Verk was already in range 7 when they arrived. I need to tell you about Verk because he's important. Part 3, Vark. Instructor Verk is Drakari, full-blood Drakari, 3rd generation from one of the military families, which in Drakari culture means something significant about lineage and martial tradition that I'm not fully qualified to explain, but that basically amounts to marksmanship is in his bones. Drakari marksmanship tradition is several thousand years old. They have techniques that predate space travel by centuries, refined through generation after generation of ritualized practice into something almost ceremonial. He's been an instructor at the GDA for 19 years. Range certification, advanced marksmanship, live fire supervision. He's trained thousands of recruits. He has written 2 of the official supplementary texts that the GDA uses in its certification program. The man knows weapons the way a musician knows sound, not just technically, but instinctively in his body. He's also, and I want to be fair here because he's not a bad person, not particularly flexible in his thinking when it comes to technique. He knows what works. He's watched it work 10,000 times. He has very little patience for what he calls experimental personal methodology, which is his diplomatic way of describing things recruits do that he didn't teach them. When the cohort filed into Range 7 that morning, Verk was standing at the central observation position with a scoring tablet in one hand and a standard-issue phase carbine in the other, held loosely, the way someone holds a tool they've been using for 20 years. He went through the standard briefing: range rules, target scoring methodology, the specific assessment protocol for today's exercise. Each recruit would fire 3 strings of 5 shots at the standard integration targets, which are designed to register hits from energy discharge, projectile impact, and 3 other weapon types used by different species in the cohort. Today's weapon was the M7 phase carbine. The M7 is a multi-species weapon. The GDA designed it specifically for the integration program. The grip is adjustable. The trigger pull weight is adjustable. The stock extends and contracts to accommodate different arm lengths. It's an engineering achievement. It's also, and this is relevant, not designed for human hands specifically, because when the design committee did its work, the full specifics of human hand physiology and its relationship to rapid-fire accuracy weren't yet in the GDA's research database. The grip technique for the M7 specifies a 2-handed grip with the support hand positioned under the forward section of the stock, fingers extended, palm applying upward pressure to stabilize. It's the standard technique. It works for the majority of species in the program. There are minor variations. Vane get a grip modification protocol because of their triple-jointed fingers. Dracari get an adjustment for hand width, but the fundamental geometry is the same for everyone. The human grip modification in the GDA protocol is modest, slightly adjusted support hand angle, nothing radical. Mara Voss had looked at the human grip modification on her first day, read through it carefully, and then apparently decided to do something else entirely. She had been doing it her whole 3 weeks at Varath 9. Other instructors had noticed. There had been a note in her training file. Nobody had directly addressed it yet because her scores on the earlier assessments had been adequate, not exceptional, just adequate. And the GDA's official position on minor technique variation is to observe before correcting. Today was going to be different. Part 4, the line. The recruits took their positions on the firing line. 20 positions, 47 recruits, so they ran it in waves. First wave was 10 recruits including 3 humans. Mara was in the first wave, position 7. I was at the back of the range, near the instructor observation station. My role that morning was documentation. I was doing a rotation through the training departments and Range 7 was on my schedule. I had a tablet. I was supposed to be taking notes on cohort performance metrics. I watched the first wave load their weapons. The M7 has a specific loading sequence that's the same regardless of species variation. The GDA standardized it to reduce confusion in the field. Insert power cell, charge handle back, release. The recruits had all done it dozens of times. They moved through the sequence with different degrees of fluency, depending on how long they'd been in the program. Mara did it fast. Not showing off fast, just fast the way someone is fast when they don't have to think about the mechanics anymore. The power cell seated, the charge handle came back and went forward in one smooth motion, and the weapon came up to her shoulder in the same continuous movement, like the whole sequence was one thing instead of 3. Verk noticed. He was watching all 10 recruits simultaneously, which is an instructor skill, the ability to see the whole line at once. But something about that particular motion caught his eye because I saw his gaze settle on position 7 and stay there. "Recruits," he said, "position and grip. Hold for check." Standard instruction. The recruits all settled into their firing positions, weapons up but not yet at full aim. Verk walked the line. He started at position 1. Drakari recruit, grip looked fine. Position 2, vein, triple-jointed fingers curling correctly. Position 3, 4, 5, he moved at a measured pace, pausing at each one, making small adjustments when needed. A word here, a repositioned hand there. He got to position 7. He stopped. He looked at Mara's grip for a long moment. And then he said, in the flat, carefully neutral tone of a professional who is not yet sure how angry he wants to be. "Recruit Voss, can you explain what you're doing with your support hand?" Part 5. The grip. The support hand position for the M7 is, as I mentioned, support hand under the stock, fingers extended, palm upward, like you're carrying a tray. Mara's support hand was not doing that. Her left hand was wrapped around the front of the stock, around it, meaning her fingers were curled over the top rather than extended beneath, and her thumb was along the side in what's called a thumb-forward position. Her grip was rotated from the standard by roughly 60 degrees. Her elbow was dropped significantly lower than the protocol specified, which changed the geometry of her entire support arm. And her firing hand, the right, had the thumb of her grip hand pressed high against the stock's upper surface in a way that looked, from outside, almost like she was trying to press the weapon away from herself rather than hold it stable. It looked wrong. I can say that honestly. To anyone trained in the it looked like a collection of technique errors that should have been corrected on day 1. Verk was staring at it with the expression of a man whose deeply held beliefs about a subject are being casually violated in front of him. "It's the grip I was taught," Mara said. Her voice was calm, not defensive, just factual. "By whom?" Verk said. "My grandfather, she paused. He was a competitive shooter on Earth before the integration. He taught me when I was 8. Verk looked at her for another moment. "The GDA, Unified Marksmanship Protocol," he said, "is not designed by an elderly human with a hobby. It is designed by a committee of specialists from 16 different species with a combined research base of." "I know what it's designed by," Mara said, same calm voice. "I've read the protocol." And yet, she agreed. There was a ripple down the firing line. The other recruits in the first wave had been holding their positions. You hold position when the instructor is speaking. It's an absolute rule, but they were aware. Eyes didn't move. Attention did. From the positions behind the firing line, where the second and third wave recruits were waiting, there was more visible movement. The Sulcan pair, Rek and Adara, had their heads tilted in that particular way that meant they were communicating in the subsonic frequency band Sulcan use for commentary they don't want recorded. The 3 Horath were just watching with the flat, undisguised curiosity that's characteristic of Horath in situations they find interesting. Sarathi, the senior Vane recruit, was very still. Verk made a decision. I could see it happen. "You will demonstrate your technique," he said. 3 shots, we will observe the results." It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. The subtext was clear to everyone in the room. You will embarrass yourself, and then you will use the correct grip. Mara nodded. "Yes, instructor." Part 6. What nobody knew to look for. Before I tell you what happened when she fired, I need to explain something. I talked to a researcher afterward, a human biomechanics specialist who'd been brought in to consult on integration training protocols, and she walked me through what I had watched without understanding. Mara's grip, that grip that looked wrong, that looked like a collection of errors. It's called the thumbs forward grip, or more specifically a variation of what competitive shooters on Earth called the modern technique, of pistol and carbine shooting. It developed in the mid-20th century and was refined through several more decades of competition and tactical application. By the time integration happened and Earth joined the GDA framework, human firearms and the training methodologies around them had been evolving under genuine selection pressure for centuries. Selection pressure meaning people died if the technique didn't work. The thing about human weapons development that the GDA's research database didn't fully capture, because the data collection happened over a relatively short window and focused on hardware rather than methodology, is that humans developed their shooting techniques under conditions of continuous lethal feedback. Wars, hunting, protection of resources. A shooting method that didn't produce accurate fire under stress got people killed and was abandoned. A method that worked survived because the people who used it survived to teach it. Mara's grandfather's grip wasn't a hobby quirk. It was the endpoint of a 200-year culling process. The thumb's forward grip does several things that the ump approach doesn't. The wrap support hand creates a rotational resistance that helps control the weapon during rapid sequential firing, not just the recoil of one shot, but the muzzle climb between shots when you're putting multiple rounds on target quickly. The dropped elbow creates a structural lock in the support arm that's actually more stable than the extended elbow ray position under dynamic movement. And the high thumb position on the firing hand gives you a tactile feedback loop on the weapon's movement that you simply don't have with the ump grip geometry. None of this is obvious from watching someone hold the weapon. It only becomes apparent when you look at results. And at Verath 9, on that cold morning in Range 7, nobody was looking for results yet. They were looking at the grip. Part 7, 3 shots. Target set, Verk said. He'd pulled up the scoring interface on his tablet. First target, the 15-meter position. Standard scoring rings. Recruit Voss, when ready. The range had gone quiet in that particular way that spaces go quiet when everyone in them is deliberately not making noise. Even the recycled air seemed to pause. Mara settled her stance. Her feet were about shoulder width apart, slightly staggered. Her weight was forward just a touch, on the balls of her feet rather than her heels. Her eyes went to the target with the focused quality of someone who has genuinely stopped thinking about anything else. The M7 came up. It came up smooth, in a controlled arc, and settled into her eyeline without hunting, without that small wobble and find sequence you see from most recruits, because they're tracking the weapon to the target rather than tracking the target with the weapon as one unified system. Small distinction, big practical difference. She fired. The M7 makes a specific sound in a closed space, a sharp crack with an electronic undertone from the phase discharge, and then a brief hum as the mechanism cycles. In Range 7, with the composite walls absorbing and redirecting, it has a flat, almost acoustic quality. Clean. She fired again before the sound of the first shot had fully died. And again. 3 shots. The whole thing took about 2 seconds, maybe 2.5. And then she brought the weapon down from her shoulder and stood easy. On the scoring display, 3 red circles appeared on the 15-meter target. Impact markers. The scoring system placed them. 1, 2, 3. All 3 hits were clustered in the centermost ring of the target. The cluster diameter, the measurement from the farthest left impact to the farthest right, was less than 3 centimeters. At 15 meters, in a live-fire exercise with a weapon she'd been using for 3 weeks, after being put on the spot in front of her entire cohort. Verk looked at the scoring display. The range stayed quiet. Again, he said, 40-meter target. Mara raised the weapon. Same process, same quality, 3 shots, same interval. The target at 40 meters lit up, 3 impacts in the center ring. Cluster slightly wider, 4.5 centimeters. The Sulcan pair had stopped their subsonic conversation. 100 meters, Verk said. This is where the thing started to shift. 100 meters with a phase carbine in a standard firing exercise in a recruit cohort is considered a solid performance marker. Not elite, solid. Getting all 3 shots on the target at 100 is what you expect from competent students. Getting them in the scoring rings is good. Getting them in the center rings is excellent. Mara raised the weapon. And here is where I noticed the thing that I now understand, but didn't understand then. When the weapon came up to her shoulder, it stopped moving almost immediately. Just stopped, with a solidity that looked wrong. Most shooters have a fine oscillation at full extension, a small movement that never quite fully settles, and they fire in the window between one oscillation and the next. Mara didn't have that oscillation. The weapon came up and locked into position with the quality of something anchored rather than held. 3 shots. All 3 in the center ring. 200 meters, said Verk, and his voice had changed. It had lost the testing you subtext. There was something else in it now. Something that was either very interested or very careful, or both. 200 meters. This is where recruit cohorts start to diverge. This is where the people who are good at this separate from the people who are trying hard. The scoring rings at 200 meters are small relative to the target face, and the mechanical imprecision of a recruit's hold under the added difficulty of distance starts to express itself in the impact distribution. Mara raised the M7 to her shoulder. She was still, genuinely still, in a way that I found myself leaning forward slightly to look at, because it didn't look like someone holding a position. It looked like someone who had simply stopped all unnecessary physical activity, like the concept of fidgeting had been removed from her. 3 shots, same tempo. She brought the weapon down. The scoring display updated. 3 impacts, 200 meters. The cluster covered about 7 centimeters, which at that distance is extraordinary. Not all 3 were in the absolute center ring. One was a ring out, but the distribution was tighter than anything I'd seen in a recruit assessment. Verk had not made a sound in about 90 seconds. The recruits in the line, the 9 other people in the first wave, were all facing downrange with weapons raised as they were supposed to be, but their attention had rotated to position 7 as thoroughly as if they'd all turned to look. Part 8, the comment. And then Rakan spoke. Rakan was a Drakari recruit, not Verk's species-level talent for marksmanship, but solid, technically proficient. He'd been first wave, position 3, and he'd been watching since the assessment started. Rakan had been talking throughout Mara's 3 weeks at Varath 9. Not maliciously. I want to be clear about that, because Rakan wasn't a bad soldier and wasn't a bad person. But he had opinions and he expressed them. He was from a military family. He'd absorbed the Drakari marksmanship tradition almost genetically. And 3 weeks of watching Mara hold the M7 in that obviously wrong way had produced a compacted store of commentary that apparently, at this moment, needed release. The grip, Rakan said, in the flat carrying tone that Drakari use for factual statement, does not accommodate the weapon's center of mass correctly. The scores are adequate, but the technique is not scalable. Under dynamic conditions, movement, stress, target acquisition on multiple axes, the support hand position will fail because the hand cannot compensate for rotational variance. This was, to be clear, textbook critique. Verk could have said the same thing. The reasoning was sound within the framework of what Rakan knew. Several of the other recruits made sounds of agreement. The Horath, who had their own marksmanship tradition involving essentially no support hand at all, because their primary arms are strong enough that one-handed hold is standard for them, were nodding in the characteristic Horath head bob that signifies assent. One of the other Drakari recruits, there were 2 others, said something in Drakari that I don't speak well enough to translate precisely, but that had the quality of a snide agreement. Mara heard it. She has better hearing than you'd think from looking at her, better than the baseline expectation for humans, which is itself better than several species in the integration program, though not all. She understood enough Drakari to catch the tone if not the specifics. She didn't respond. She held the weapon in the rest position and looked downrange. Rakan continued. The planet origin data for Terran recruits indicates that the primary physical aptitude profile is oriented toward endurance and adaptability rather than precision ballistic work. Which makes this, he gestured at the scoring display, a reasonable performance, but the ceiling is clear. The grip will not hold under the conditions we'll actually face. It was delivered as analysis. It wasn't meant to wound. But the sullen pair had resumed their subsonic conversation, and the direction of their gaze was suggesting that whatever they were saying was not supportive. And the third Drakari recruit made another comment. I caught 3 words of it. They were Terran threshold grip. I don't know the full phrase. The inflection on threshold in Drakari has a specific meaning. It suggests something that's barely adequate, that's at the lowest acceptable boundary. That a thing is technically passing but should not be celebrated. Threshold grip is not a compliment. Mara still didn't respond. She was doing the thing where she'd gotten very still, but this time it wasn't shooting stillness. This was different. This was the stillness of someone who has heard something and has decided, very consciously, what to do about it. Verk had not spoken since he called the last distance. I looked at him. His expression was complicated. Part 9, 400. 400 meters, said Verk. The range went even more quiet if that's possible. 400 meters is the maximum range of range 7. It's also, technically, beyond the effective engagement range of the M7 phase carbine in recruit hands under standard assessment conditions. The target at 400 is the largest target face on the range. It has to be visible at that distance, and landing hits at 400 with a phase carbine is achievable, but it's not what recruits are expected to do in this assessment. It's not part of the scoring protocol. It's a bonus distance that exists on the range map as an option, but that Verk had never, in my observation, actually deployed. He was looking at Mara when he said it. Not testing her anymore, he had moved past that. This was something else. He was the kind of professional who, when confronted with data that doesn't match his model, has to push the data to its limit before he can decide what to do with it. Several recruits in the first wave visibly shifted. This was not normal. This was departure from the protocol. Rakan had gone quiet. Mara looked down the range toward 400 meters. The target was barely visible at that distance with the range lighting, a gray rectangle in the deep shadow of the hull extension. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the M7 in her hands. 400, she confirmed, not a question. 400, Verk said. She raised the weapon. I am going to try very hard to describe what happened in the next 10 seconds accurately, because I've told this story a lot of times since, and I want to be precise. The M7 came to her shoulder. The whole line of her body adjusted slightly, her weight shifted, her back straightened, and there was a small movement in her support arm that looked like a deliberate repositioning rather than a settle. She dropped her center of gravity almost imperceptibly, like she was rooting. She was breathing. I could see it, the slight movement of her shoulders. And then the movement stopped, which was her exhaling and holding at the bottom, which is what competitive shooters on Earth call the respiratory pause, the window in the breath cycle where the body is most still. She held it. 5 seconds. 6, 7. And then she fired. One shot. The phase discharge sound bounced off the composite walls, off the deep ceiling, came back in overlapping echoes that made the single shot sound like something larger. On the scoring display, 400 meters out, a hit marker appeared. Center ring. The silence in range 7 lasted about 3 full seconds. 3 seconds is a long time when nothing is happening. Then she fired the second shot. Center ring. She breathed twice, the respiratory pause again. Third shot. Center ring. She brought the weapon down. The scoring display showed 3 hits at 400 meters, all in the center ring, in a cluster so tight it had to be measured by the system's auto-scale function rather than the human-readable ring display. The cluster diameter came back at 6 centimeters. 6 centimeters. At 400 meters. With a phase carbine. By a recruit. Rakan said nothing. The sullen pair said nothing. Nobody said anything. Part 10. The Whisper. Verk walked down the range to position 7. He moved slowly. Not dramatically slowly. He wasn't performing. He was walking the way someone walks when they need the time to organize what they're going to say before they arrive at the place they're saying it. He stopped next to Mara. She was holding the M7 in the rest position. She wasn't looking at the scoring display. She was looking at him with the calm, attentive look of a recruit waiting for an instructor's assessment. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her hands, specifically at the support hand, that wrapped, thumbs forward, elbow down grip that had been the subject of comment and critique for 3 weeks. He reached out and with 2 thick Drakari fingers touched the point where her support hand met the stock, not to adjust it, just to feel the geometry, to understand it through contact the way a craftsperson understands a joint by running their finger along it. He made a small sound, low, almost subvocal. I think it was involuntary. And then he stepped very slightly back, so that he was adjacent to Mara rather than facing her, both of them oriented in the same direction down the range. The posture of 2 people looking at the same thing rather than at each other. And he said, quietly, close to her ear, not projecting for the range the way he'd been speaking before, he said, "Only Earthborn can shoot like that." He said it like a fact, not an observation he was making in the moment. A fact he had just confirmed with his own eyes and his own hands and his own data, a fact that had perhaps been somewhere in the back of his professional mind, but that he had not previously had occasion to verify. I was close enough to hear it because the range was completely silent, and because Verk is Drakari and Drakari voices carry even at low volume. And I watched Mara process it. She didn't react immediately. That was one of the things that struck me. There was no relief, no vindication, no small triumphant softening. She just received it. Like information she'd already known, delivered by someone else who had arrived at it on their own. Then she said very quietly, "My grandfather used to say that too." And Verk said he was correct. Part 11. What came after? The assessment continued. It had to. There were 46 other recruits who needed to fire their assessments and the range schedule was structured. Verk returned to the observation position. The first wave completed their strings. The second and third waves rotated through. The atmosphere in the range for the rest of the morning was different. I've been in a lot of training environments, and I've felt a lot of different room temperatures in the metaphorical sense. And what Range 7 felt like for the remaining 2 hours of that assessment was the specific quality of a space where the dominant assumption has been revised. Not shattered, revised. There's a difference. Shattered feels like chaos. Revised feels like a room that's been rearranged while you weren't looking. Everything is still recognizable, but nothing is quite where you expected it. Rakan fired his assessment without comment. His scores were excellent. He genuinely was a good shot. But he spent several minutes after his string looking at the scoring display in a way that suggested he was doing math. The sullen pair filed through their assessment and then stood near the back wall for the remainder of the morning, watching. No subsonic conversation, just watching. Sarathi, the senior Vane recruit, who had said that thing about Mara moving like prey that learned to think like a predator, fired her string, posted solid scores, and then spent approximately 45 minutes standing 2 meters from the Position 7 platform looking at the scoring record that Mara's assessment had generated, which remained visible on the range's secondary display even after the assessment moved on. The Horath were the most visibly affected. Horath don't hide their reactions the way some species do. They have a different cultural relationship to expressed emotional response. The 3 Horath recruits were openly discussing what they'd seen in Horath for most of the rest of the morning. I don't speak Horath, but the gestures, the broad, expressive hand movements they use were clearly demonstrative. They were replaying the shots in motion. And Verk stood at the observation position and ran the assessment with his usual professionalism, his usual precision, his usual measured and competent instruction. He didn't speak about what had happened at Position 7. He didn't refer to it. He didn't single Mara out for attention or deference. He ran the rein the way he always ran the range. But twice, when he walked the line during subsequent waves, he paused at Position 7, even though Mara wasn't there anymore. He stood at the empty platform and looked down the range toward 400 meters, and there was an expression on his face that I recognized, from years of watching professionals encounter things outside their expertise, as the expression of a very competent person revising a foundational assumption. It's a rare look. It's worth seeing when you catch it. Part 12, the debrief. After the range session, there was a standard debrief in the classroom module adjacent to Range 7. Verk ran it. The cohorts sat in their configuration. The tables are arranged to accommodate all the different body types, which means the room looks slightly chaotic but functions fine, and Verk went through the assessment results. He's thorough in debriefs. It's one of the things that makes him a good instructor. He doesn't rush the analysis. He goes through each element, each recruit's results, each point of improvement and commendation. When he got to Mara's assessment results, he pulled up the full scoring record and put it on the room display. 3 rows of data, 15 meters, 40 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters, 400 meters, the clusters, the hit rates, the timing. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when data is being presented that speaks for itself. Recruit Voss, Verk said, has posted the highest precision score in this cohort's assessment history at this station. He said it the way he said all assessment results, neutral, factual, no inflation. He paused, then added, the technique that produced these results does not conform to the unified marksmanship protocol as written. Another pause. I am submitting a formal research request to the GDA Marksmanship Division to review the human Earthborn shooting methodology for potential integration into a revised supplemental protocol for Terran recruits. The room was very still. Verk looked up from his tablet. He looked at Mara. The grip that your grandfather taught you, he said. Who taught him? Mara thought for a moment. He learned from his father, and he said his father learned from a man who'd spent 30 years in competition, and before that, she shook her head slightly, I don't actually know how far back it goes. He said it was older than any of us. Verk made a note on his tablet. It will be important data, he said. Rakan, from his seat near the back of the room, said something. His voice was different from how it had been on the range, quieter, without the certainty. He said in standard lingua, the technique, the support hand position, is there documentation? Verk looked at him, then at Mara. Mara said, my grandfather had videos, old Earth recordings. The technique has a name, several names actually. It developed over a couple hundred years on Earth. There's a lot written about it. We would want access to that material, Verk said. Not a question. I can request it from my family, Mara said. Please do. Part 13, later that evening. I found Mara in the common space off the secondary corridor at about the 18th hour. Vareth 9 runs a 23-hour operational cycle. The lighting shifts gradually to signal day phase and night phase, but it's more suggestion than regulation. The common space at that hour had the yellowish warmth of the dim daylights, and about 8 other people in it doing various evening routines. She was sitting on one of the Horath scale benches, which are built wide and low because Horath are wide and low. So she was perched on it the way a smaller person perches on furniture designed for someone else. She had a heating unit in her hands. The Varath 9 beverage dispensary doesn't have anything remotely like Earth coffee, but there's a grain-based hot drink from the Sulcan supply chain that Mara had started drinking in week 1 and seemed to find acceptable, and she was looking at nothing in particular. I asked if I could sit. She said yes. We didn't talk about the range immediately. We talked about other things. She'd gotten a message from home, her family, something about a cousin's graduation ceremony. She was carrying that particular quality of homesickness that people who have left somewhere significant carry, that mix of pride in their choice and awareness of distance. Not unhappy, just aware. Eventually, I asked her about the grip. She looked at her hands. My grandfather had this set up in his garage, she said. A practice range, just a narrow space between the workbench and the wall, about 10 meters. He had a target at the end. He'd been shooting since he was a kid. When I was 8, he decided I was old enough to learn. She turned her hands over, looking at them. He put the weapon in my hands and he stood behind me and he moved my hands into this position, the way his father had put his hands. And he said, I still remember what he said. He said, "This is how we do it. This is how it's always been done. I don't know if anyone else does it this way, but I know it works." She paused. I spent a lot of years on the range, she said, competition and otherwise. I had coaches along the way who tried to change the grip. Some of them were very sure it was wrong. I tried the other way once for about 6 months because the coach I had that year was very experienced and I trusted him. My scores dropped by 17%. She said it without drama, just the number. I went back to the grip. Did you know, I asked, before today, that it was going to produce those results with the M7? She thought about it honestly. I knew the principle would transfer, she said. The specific weapon, the distance, no, I didn't know, I hoped. She paused again. My grandfather used to say that the geometry is the geometry. You can change the tool. If you understand why the position works on any tool. I thought about that. What did you feel when Verk said it? I asked. The thing he said. She took a sip of the grain drink, considered. Relieved, she said finally, and also a little sad because my grandfather, he died 2 years ago. He never got to see any of this. She made a gesture that encompassed vaguely the whole station, the GDA program, the fact of being this far from Earth. He'd have loved it. He was so curious about all of it. He never got to see. She stopped, looked at the heating unit in her hands. He never got to see what his grip could do at 400 meters on a phase carbine. We sat quiet for a bit. From down the corridor, there were sounds, other recruits in the living quarters section, the normal evening sounds of a full cohort winding down. Somewhere a Horath was laughing, that particular deep resonant sound. Rakan came to find me, Mara said, about an hour after the debrief. What did he say? He asked me to show him the grip. She smiled. It was a small smile, slightly sideways. I showed him. And he tried it for about 20 minutes. He said his hand doesn't sit at that angle comfortably. The joint geometry is different. She looked at her hand, flexed her fingers. He said he could see what it was doing structurally, but that it wasn't built for his anatomy. He was polite about it, genuine actually. Rakan is not good at pretending things. What he said was, I understand now why it was taught. I do not understand how your body does it. What did you say? I said my grandfather always said the same thing. That it looked wrong until you saw what it did. Part 14, the research. I'm going to skip forward because some of what happened in the weeks after isn't dramatic, and this story isn't about drama for its own sake. It's about what actually happened. Verk submitted the research request to the GDA Marksmanship Division. It got routed through 3 departments over about 6 weeks and eventually landed with a team of specialists, who included a human biomechanics researcher named Dr. Tenika Os and 2 Drakari ballistics experts, which is the right combination for this kind of work because you need the human physiological knowledge and the Drakari precision methodology working together. Dr. Osai, when she interviewed me as part of the research documentation process, said something that I've thought about many times since. She said, "The thing that the GDA's initial integration research missed is that human marksmanship technique didn't develop in laboratories. It developed under mortality, for hundreds of years, on a planet with no technological advantage over its own predators and in a constant state of internal conflict. Humans were developing and refining weapons technique in an environment where being wrong meant death. Not failing an assessment, not posting a poor score. Death. The selection pressure for effective technique is unlike anything any other species in the integration program has experienced in their equivalent developmental period, because most other species developed ranged weaponry after they had already reached a certain level of social stability. Humans did not have that luxury." She paused and looked at her notes. "What we call Earthborn technique," she said, "is essentially the accumulated result of centuries of human beings dying until the right methods survived. It's brutal archaeology. And it's extraordinarily effective." The research team spent 4 months documenting the human marksmanship tradition, the thumbs-forward grip specifically, but also the broader body of technique, the stance, the breath work, the sight alignment methodology, the concept of smooth continuous trigger press that human competitive shooting had refined to a remarkable degree. They pulled historical footage, competitive records, military training documentation, the entire documented lineage of the technique. What they found was what Dr. Osai described: a methodology that had evolved under genuinely extreme selection pressure into something that maximized what human physiology specifically could do with a handheld weapon. The formal research report, which the GDA Marksmanship Division published about 8 months after the Vareth 9 incident, concluded with a recommendation to revise the supplemental protocol for Terran recruits significantly. Not just the grip modification, but a comprehensive Earthborn-specific methodology section that codified the human technique properly for the first time in the GDA system. Verk was listed as a contributing researcher. He had, according to the documentation, provided the initial test data and performance observation report that triggered the investigation. In the acknowledgments section of the report, there is a single line that reads, "The researchers acknowledge with gratitude the contribution of the late name, competitive marksman, Earth, whose teaching methodology initiated the inquiry that produced this document." The name was Mara's grandfather. When Mara saw the report, someone sent her a copy. I think it was Dr. Osai. She read the acknowledgments line 3 times. She told me later it took her about 5 minutes in a bathroom stall to get herself together enough to go back to her duties. She showed up to morning formation with her eyes slightly red, but her bearing exactly as it always was.